So, in the world of modern software, our data is, well, it's everywhere, right? It's scattered across dozens of different services. So, the real question is, how do you actually bring it all together for the user without creating this total mess on the back end? Well, Wix has a surprisingly simple rule for this, and it all starts by putting the user's own application in charge.
Okay, so here's what we're going to cover. First, we'll dive into the default rule, client-side joins. Then we'll look at why that works so well, before getting to the really juicy part, knowing exactly when to break that rule. We'll also see how this whole logic applies to writing data, not just reading it, and then we'll wrap it all up with Wix's final, super simple takeaway.
All right, let's get right into it. The foundation, the starting point. At Wix, their default approach, the simplest and most preferred way to combine data, is to let the client application do the heavy lifting.
So what exactly is a client-side join? It's actually pretty straightforward. It just means the app running on your phone or in your browser makes separate requests for each piece of data it needs. Then it just stitches them together itself. All that work happens right there on the user's device, not on some complex backend server. Okay, let's make this super concrete. Picture this. Your app first fetches a task from one service. It gets that task data back and sees a little piece of information inside, a contact ID. So it just turns around and makes a second, completely separate call to another service saying, hey, can you give me the contact that matches this ID? Two simple, clean, direct steps. That's it.
Now, I know what you might be thinking. Isn't that just pushing more work onto the client? And yeah, kind of. But there are some huge advantages to making this your go-to move. Let's look at why this approach actually works so well.
So this approach is absolutely perfect when the client just needs a little bit of extra info, not the entire database. It's great for things that don't happen all the time, where a tiny delay is perfectly fine. But the biggest benefit, and this is the big one, is that it keeps your backend services independent. One team can completely overhaul their service and it won't break what another team is doing. For any company that wants to move fast, that is a massive win.
All right, so this all sounds great, doesn't it? Simple, independent services, what's not to love? But here's the thing. No rule is perfect. And that leads us to the most important question of all. When does this approach break?
You know, every good rule has its exceptions. And honestly, knowing when to break the rule is just as important as knowing the rule in the first place. This is where we have to start thinking about moving that work back over to the server. Okay, breaking point number one, complex filtering. Just imagine trying to find all the tasks that are assigned to contacts living in a specific city. The poor client would have to download like all the tasks, then all the contacts, and then try to sort through that giant pile of data right there on the device. It's a disaster. It's incredibly slow and it just doesn't scale at all. Next up, and this is a big one, raw performance. Think about it. Every single request your app makes is a trip to the server and back. If your screen needs 2, 3, maybe 4 different pieces of data, well, those little trips start to add up. Your app feels sluggish, slow. When performance is absolutely critical, you're much better off with a single, fast call to the server that just gives you everything you need in one go. And the third breaking point, it's all about making life easier for your developers. I mean, if literally 99% of the time someone fetches a task, the very next thing they do is fetch the related contact, why on earth would you make every developer write that same two-step code over and over and over again? It just makes your API clunky and annoying to use. For those super common patterns, it's just better to give them a single endpoint that returns both. Okay, so everything we've talked about so far has been about reading data. But what about writing it, creating new stuff? Well, as it turns out, the exact same client-first philosophy applies. By default, you let the client run the show. Let's walk through what that looks like. First, the client sends a request to create a contact. The server does its thing and sends back the ID of the new contact. Then, the client immediately takes that brand new ID and uses it to make a second request to create a related task. The client is basically the director here, telling each service what to do and in what order. But you guessed it, the same kind of exceptions apply here too. What happens if the first step works, creating the contact, but then your Wi-Fi drops before the second step can happen? Now you've got this orphan contact with no task attached. That's a partial failure, and it can be a real headache. If making sure that never happens is absolutely critical, you need to move that logic to the server. Same thing goes for super common multi-part updates, where a single API call is just way more efficient. So let's bring this all together. We've looked at the default rule, we've looked at the exceptions for both reading and writing data,
And what it all boils down to is a really simple, really elegant philosophy for managing these complex systems. And here it is, the big rule of thumb. Start with the simplest thing you can possibly do, let the client do the work. This approach forces your back-end services to stay clean, independent, and way easier to manage. Just make this your default setting for every new feature you build. So this is your final cheat sheet. This is how you put this into practice. You stick with that simple client-first rule unless you run into one of these 4 specific problems. This little list is your guide, turning what could be a really complex architectural decision into a clear, simple checklist. It really makes you wonder, right? How many of the complications in your own backend could be totally simplified just by starting with this one simple rule?